Thanks, Larry. And thanks to you, JavaScript, all the local coders coming out to see me. My name is Ben Sweedler, and I am a front-end developer. I work at Tablet Media, which is a local internet service provider. And I'm a local myself. I grew up here in Urbana, and I'm also part of the local music scene. I play in a jazz band. I play violin with my two brothers. But there was a brief moment when I wasn't a local. I went to California to go attend Cal Poly, got a computer science degree, and for a hot minute, I was working in the Bay Area. But then I quickly burned out. I ended up taking 3 years off coding, but with a happy ending. I ended up discovering front-end development here, and now I'm here talking to you. But there was a moment where I came back to coding, and it felt like everything had changed. There's an article that was released in 2017 called "Everything Easy is Hard Again" by Frank Camaro, and he uses the example of layouts and how there's been many different ways, and it feels like there's always a new thing that I have to learn to just put two things next to each other. So my talk is not about layouts. My talk is about making user interfaces. And I remember if I wanted to create a user interface, I had just used a library called jQuery and a library called Bootstrap. And when I came back to front-end development, it felt like I had to learn one of these modern JavaScript frameworks. And was there anything equivalent to Bootstrap anymore? So my first questions were, okay, what's the best thing? I need to use the best JavaScript framework. And is Bootstrap outdated? Can I use that? Those are hard questions to answer. So my talk is going to be a bit simpler. What is one reason people use these JavaScript frameworks? They're component-based. And can I still make Bootstrap-looking forms that are nice and easy for a developer like me? Well, there's reusable component libraries. And there's not one reusable component library as ubiquitous as Bootstrap. Instead, there's a bunch. So that's why I'm giving this talk. So hopefully, let you know some of the different libraries that are available, and by the end of the talk, maybe you'll have a new tool that you want to use. First, a little introduction to these JavaScript frameworks that seem to have taken the industry by storm. I like describing them as single-page app development libraries. There's Angular, which is written by Google, React, which comes from Facebook, and Vue comes from a developer named Eric Fu. And these libraries are the most useful when creating a web app. And here I'm differentiating between a web page and a web app, where the app has more complexity, more user interfaces, much more that has to happen. And in a traditional page-based website, someone requests a page from the server. That page is maybe static and just already created, or maybe it needs to be generated by a backend. But either way, the browser renders the page that has been requested. In these single-page apps, there's only actually one page. It's the page with the JavaScript framework on it. And it's that framework's job to decide what components need to be fetched to generate something that can be used. And maybe there isn't really too much difference here. Often there's still at the end of the day some HTML, some JavaScript, and some CSS to render on the page. Now we're just bundling them into small components. And so my definition of a component is a piece of interface. All these frameworks have their own specifics of what a component is, and it's probably the most generic term you could call anything in technology. But for the purposes of this talk, a component could be anything like the navigation bar on Twitter's homepage, or my profile, the composed tweet component. That's my favorite component. So everything is a component, even the tweet button. Now, you might say it's a little overzealous just to divide up everything into components. But I don't think it's zealous enough. I want to divide our components into their structure, their presentation, and their behavior. Where the structure would be what sort of user interface element it is. Like it's a button, and maybe the content of that, so that it says tweet. The presentation would be that this component is a button that's blue and has rounded corners. And when I hover over it, it darkens. Ooh, that makes me want to click on it. I'm going to. Ah, my tweet has been sent off to the Twitterverse. That would be the behavior of the component. Why are we getting so verbose in explaining what the structure and presentation and behavior of the single piece of a user interface is? A little bit of it is separation of concerns, and traditionally there's a separation of technology too, where you use some sort of markup language, some styling, and some programming language to define what you want a piece of the user interface to do. But more recently, that's not true. Almost everything's just done with the JavaScript. And maybe that's the greatest difference between these JavaScript frameworks. Is sometimes there's CSS in the JavaScript, and HTML might be there too. And that's the first big one thing I had to learn, is that it wasn't so easy anymore to take libraries and put them directly in my HTML. I have to use a package manager. And so when I first learned this, it just seemed, why am I doing this? Is there any use to it? And one of the main reasons is having opinionated code that is written in components that have clearly defined interfaces helps make them reusable. So on the Twitter homepage, I can see that there are many parts that got reused. My profile pic shows up 3 times, and the tweet button, that shows up twice. And so it's cost effective to make a website that's full of components that you're reusing. So the tweet that shows what a tweet is, I can see that when I'm searching for tweets, when I make a tweet, and if I need to update that information, I'm only sending down to the phone or the computer information like how many retweets and who the username is. I don't have to send all of the styling and all of the HTML. So there's less bytes down the line. And having everything based on components helps consistency across the site as well. So Twitter used to have square profile pictures, and then they decided they wanted circular profile pictures. And if they had to change that piece of code in a lot of places, it would have been pretty easy to miss a niche corner of the site and have those square profile pictures remain. So having a single component that's in charge of the presentation of how round the corners on the profile pictures need to be helps people move faster. And finally, it helps to collaborate when everything is written in small pieces with clearly defined interfaces. So it's not very common that you just have a single person working on a web app. You have lots of people working on a web app. And often you have lots of people working on lots of different web apps. And you might want to share pieces of those web apps with each other. So often, a lot of these components are custom made for a specific use case, like the compose tweet components. But there are a lot of common form elements that show up all over the place, like buttons and navigation bars and checkboxes and dialog boxes. And so that's where these pre-written reusable component libraries come in handy. There is a bunch of them, and they all provide the sort of form elements that we know and love. The trick now is to figure out which one to use. But before I go further, I want to mention that the term reusable component library, that's not ubiquitous. There's lots of words for a library that has some form elements that you might want. There might be some slight difference between a pattern library and a component library. But at the end of the day, there's libraries that help you share code and share design. But I did want to mention design systems, or sort of an umbrella term that might encompass a component library, but not necessarily be a component library. So material design is Google's design system, and it helps them have a very similar look and feel, for instance, for the search bar between their applications. But there's a chance that the search bar in Google Apps, Maps and Google Play Music aren't actually the same component. They just have designs that look very similar. And so I wanted to mention that these component libraries are more about how do I share code across things. So I'm defining it as a collection of common design elements. A lot of these component libraries come with themes, so they're a little easier to make look nice. And sometimes they come with a toolkit of sets for the designers to design with. Often there's an option for paid support, so you can pay the company that makes the library to help you out when you have trouble. And a lot of these component libraries are based on a specific JavaScript framework or a specific design system. And so that's a good thing to keep in mind. So for the rest of the talk, I want to go through some of the component libraries that I researched and just give you a couple bits of information about them. But first, Bootstrap. That's from 2011. It's super popular. There was a period of the web where Bootstrap was almost overused, and so it's easy to spot. But it was one of the first libraries that gave developers a really easy, it doesn't necessarily need to be easy, but a method of styling their forms. Aside from making beautiful forms, it also introduced Bootstrap to mobile-first design. So back then, it was often that you had a mobile version of your website and a regular version of your website. And Bootstrap was trying to tackle, hey, can't we have some stylings that fit both? And in Bootstrap 3, they added jQuery and JavaScript into the library because it began as just a silent library. Now we're up to Bootstrap 4. And that Bootstrap 4 still exists, and it's very popular, and there's lots of libraries like it. But it doesn't play very nicely with some of these modern frameworks, mainly because Bootstrap works by looking over the entire web page and sort of paint roller, just styling the whole thing and how it wants. And these component libraries are very opinionated about how components are set up, and they try to keep everything encapsulated, and this component only can talk to this component. And so there could be problems when Bootstrap says, I have an accordion menu that slides over everything, and I just want to do that. But it turns out that a lot of the parts of Bootstrap show up in all the component libraries in the future. It's sort of the golden bar for having a library like this. So one thing is Bootstrap introduced this 12-grid layout, this 12-column layout, and I noticed that that's in almost all of these reusable component libraries. So there's another thing you have to learn the layout. And it's popular enough that there are reusable component libraries for all the major frameworks that have the exact same naming scheme and styling of Bootstrap. And it's even harder for me to tell what the difference between these libraries are, but just the fact that there are more than one Bootstrap React library at least shows that Bootstrap has long-lasting appeal. If you don't like the stylings of Bootstrap, it turns out that there are multiple libraries that have a different styling, like material design. So Google makes Angular, so they obviously have a version of that that is components that look like material design for Angular. But lots of other people have created their own component libraries. And again, they all have slight differences, and it's one of those things that was even hard for me to tell in my research. Quasar, I noticed, had a iOS and a material design theme, so maybe they're going for something like that, and each of them have their own maybe pros or cons. I also noticed there is a library that's very much like Bootstrap called Materialize that isn't for these these JavaScript frameworks, but if you just want to paint roll your entire page to look like Material. Here are some other component libraries I found. NGX Lite seems aimed if all of this is overwhelming and these libraries are too big. Some of them have like 115 different components to choose from. Semantic UI React is a component library that tries to have a very clear naming scheme, because in Material, everything is named about like, well, material. So things talk about the edges and how the wording is very metaphoric in Material. Material is the metaphor. So semantic UI is supposed to be a design system that is a little more clear. Element UI is for view, and I believe it is not mobile first on purpose. It's supposed to be aimed at a desktop app. And that's just an interesting design decision. Vaadin is a component library that works with Angular and that uses the actual technology called web components. Because as strange as it is, a lot of these component libraries, web components is a specific tech, and it might not have nothing to do with how these component libraries are created. In this case, it does use that. Grommet is a React component library that uses styled components, which is a different way of doing the CSS. And Buffy is a Vue library that uses Bulma, which is a CSS library. So it turns out if you have any sort of other technologies you're trying to tie into, there's probably some sort of component library that fits your needs. The trick is just finding it. A lot of these component libraries only work with a specific framework, but there are a couple that work with all three. Often these component libraries are part of a big company that their whole business model is, I sell a component library, and there's paid support. I might also sell Bootstrap themes and big templates to make apps quicker. So one's in UI, I forget it's Quirk. All of these are slightly different, and because they are out there, but my recommendation is a lot of them, they began with one framework in mind. So to check what is the framework that they were originally based on could be a good idea. It turns out that a lot of companies, they create their own component libraries, but then they release those libraries. Often it's because they're trying to make developers integrate with their systems more often. So Lightning is Salesforce's design system, and there's a group of Lightning components, and they release those so people can build apps that fit in sort of Salesforce's software as a service better. So it's sort of an appeal to build with their system. Polaris is Shopify's component library, and it's not necessary if you want to make a Shopify plugin, but it might make your Shopify plugin work in the admin dashboard for Shopify, which is a e-commerce platform. Fabric UI is the component library to make Office 365 things, so like an Outlook plugin. Atlas Kit is Atlassian, so if you want to make Jira components. So those seem very based on someone who's trying to integrate with their software. But other component libraries seem to be more open, where they're asking people to make whatever they want with it. Clarity is VMware's component library for Angular, and they sort of have done a good job of documenting it and making it very open. Even if you're not doing VMware projects, please use it. There's also some component libraries that are only for internal use, but they're shown open source as a way to convince programmers to work for them. So Rizzo is the component library for Lonely Planet, and it looks really nice, and it does make me think, oh, they're doing cool things over at that Lonely Planet. Same with Origami and Gestalt, which is Financial Times and Pinterest's component libraries. I even noticed that some governments have design systems and component libraries. So the US Patent Office, and there's a United States Web Design System. These were created by contractors, like when they had contractors come in and change the healthcare website, they were like, we're going to make a design system for it. But a lot of times there's components for these things. They're all open source. So in the final part of the talk, I just want to give you some advice on how my adventures in front-end development have gone so far in regards to components. So all of these component libraries have a website. If you're trying to figure out if you want to use one, go to the website. Check out the aesthetics, because it's impossible not to. And it's going to influence your decision regardless, and that's sort of the reason you're using one of these anyways. And I like looking at the drop-down component, because there's like 100 components to choose from, and it's hard to know, well, everyone has the same button component. But drop-down's a tricky one to get right. You often want that keyboard navigation for states. You want maybe to be able to use other things with it, so just see if that one looks good, and maybe also the table component. And then also look at the accessibility. A huge portion of this component library, one of the cells, is we've included the ARIA tags and the accessibility portions for you, so it might be easier. But that doesn't always mean it will be easier, and so see how much lip service they've given to that and what looks good. And same with internationalization, it's not really your component library's job to do translations. Usually they will say you need a third-party library for it, but just to see that they might have some sort of support for right-to-left text or something in the documentation that talks about it could be very useful. And there's only so much you can learn on the website. You should go to GitHub, and not to look at the code necessarily, but just to look at the community involvement. Because all of these libraries, they're an ecosystem, and you're kind of joining in on it. So it needs to be something you think will be around for a while, and you're going to be interacting with other developers using this library if you choose to use one. And so I like to look at the last commit date to see if it's still maintained. And the README file. Because the final thing you're going to do is install it. If you're looking through a ton of different options, installing it isn't just actually a super easy task. Often, figuring out the minutia of how it integrates with your various platforms, your stack, can be hard. So that's why I put this as the last step. And only to be done if you really think the library might be an option. So at Pavlov, we were looking to move from Bootstrap and AngularJS to Angular 2. And we chose PrimeNG as our reusable component library. It's a component library that works with all of the frameworks. And here's some of the things I've learned from using it. One, we had a specific case for theming it that involves, we have two different companies, one's purple, one's green. Sometimes we want that to show as one color or the other. And that was actually pretty tricky, even though there's lots of theming options. There's lots of tiny details, like is this decided at runtime or build time? Do you have a base theme that you want to be applied everywhere? So you could make a change to that and have it hit both sites. So my recommendation is don't save the theme until the end. That's actually one of the most important things. And if it's a company that has paid themes, maybe they don't have too much incentive to make the theming that easy because they want you to buy their themes. We were trying to make a delete confirmation, and the base component had a yes and no, and we wanted that to say delete and cancel. And we wanted delete to be red and to make it more obvious. And that was really easy to do. And then we realized, well, we want delete to be in the corner of the modal, because often the call to action is in the corner, and that was almost impossible. Just the component had its structure set in stone, and it would involve some trickery to make it look like we ended up just saying, as long as it's consistent, it's fine. But my advice here is you never really know what's going to be editable in these libraries until you try. Finally, there's this component in PrimeNG that tables, and that's a common component, and there's tons of features. You can have global filter, you can have columns and pagination. And it's really tempting to want to use all those features. Wow, look how awesome my tables can be. And realize that even if it's a flag that you turn on to get these features, and that sounds simple, you're making the complexity of the app much harder and how hard it is to maintain it much harder. So my advice would be, these libraries have hundreds of components and some of them have a billion different options, but it doesn't mean your app has to use all of them. Finally, even if you're using one of these libraries, you're going to have to be creating your own or extending them. And I had a friend who noticed their website had like 6 different dropdowns across the website. And he decided, I'm going to make a new dropdown component that is super generic and it can do all of these different things. And so he worked hard and he built it, and then there were 7 dropdowns across the website that all had different because even though components are supposed to be reusable, it doesn't have to actually be reusable. It's fine for a component to be in one place. I was making a component that was a modal using PyMG's modal, and I wanted to add forms to it, so it would have a confirm button that was disabled unless you filled out the form. And I spent some time figuring out how to inject this form into it and set up the validation, and it was pretty good, but no one ended up using it for a while because I didn't document it. And I realized that when it comes to these component libraries, people have a very high expectation of seeing a visual documentation. That's how Bootstrap is. And so it does not enough to comment your code, actually. You have to perhaps make your own kitchen sink app that has all of the components and examples of how you're using them. And there is a bunch of third-party documentation libraries out there, and a lot of them are also tied in with a way to publish components. So you can have them in their own environment. And there's more than I could list here. And yeah, those seem useful. Finally, 2 useful blogs I found were Bit, which is sort of maybe trying to be the GitHub of components. There's a lot of writings about like top 10 Angular component libraries. So that's a good blog to check out. And Inclusive Components is a blog that's about making inclusive and accessibility decisions in things like tab menus and tables. That's a useful one to check out too. Finally, my take-home messages. 1, they exist, but they're definitely part of an ecosystem. And when you use one of these libraries, you're sort of buying into a couple technologies at once. And so maybe they're best used for applications that have some sort of longevity that are semi-complex. And they might not be as nice for a one-off web page. And also, there is so much variation on terminology. All of this is people just creating things for other people to use, which is good. As software developers, we stand on the shoulders of giants. So there's tons of open source code out there for you to use. It might all be called different things. End result, it doesn't have to be intimidating. Thanks.